Welcome into the Autzen Audibles podcast. Erik Skopil, Jared Mack on the show. I'm Matt Prehm. Spring football is in the air. Spring football will start for Oregon on Thursday. We're recording this on a Tuesday, March 11th. The Ducks will have 2 practices before taking a multi-week break for spring break and finals and what have you, and then they'll be back in time to report back for April, and that's where a majority of spring football will exist for the Ducks. But nonetheless, we will hear about spring football this week. The Ducks will be practicing inside the Mo or inside Autzen Stadium because their new practice facility is being built and their outdoor area is gone. It's all dirt right now. But Erik, Jared, and I will not be in practice. Dan Lanning this year has kind of shut down access for at least the first 2 practices. We'll see what happens in April. But we anticipate we're going to speak with Dan Lanning and maybe a couple other people associated with the program on Saturday. Nonetheless, it's going to be an event where we get to learn about what's new. And on today's show, we're going to talk about some of the storylines. There's a lot of new faces, a lot of new storylines this season. Erik, why don't you lead us off first with just kind of what stands out, what's to learn about this year's team?
Yeah, well, and you, excuse me, you kind of nailed it there, Matt, in terms of like, we're not going to learn a lot. We don't get practice access this week, but speak with Dan on Thursday, speak with Tosh and Will on Saturday. I think get at least a roster. No heights and weights, but I think we should at least know who's enrolled and who's on the team. That'll probably be like one of the bigger storylines of like who's actually here, who they're waiting for in April, who they're waiting for to enroll in summer. So those are like the kind of the early items we'll get this week and that you can kind of be looking out for over on Duck territory. And then we get to talk to the coaches about what's going on. And I'm curious. I mean, not necessarily to dive right into the storylines, but of like, what do you make of this roster, Dan and Will and Tosh? Like, you guys have really kind of put this thing together. I don't want to say on the fly, but that's just every offseason now where there's a lot of new pieces here. This is a very different team. Like Jared and I just did our 2 deep predictions, and Jared, like, how many returning starters are there on offense and defense combined? It's like 5. It's a totally different team.
Yeah, I think it's just 3 on the defensive side, or 4 if you want to include Devin Jackson every once in a while.
Yeah, so it's a totally different team. So, like, just broadly, like, what are the thoughts with this roster? What were they kind of trying to do? I know we won't get their entire strategy because that's something that is off limits, but just to kind of get a sense of what this offseason meant, what some of the goals were, and kind of what they think they are, where they're at, I guess I should say, going into the start of spring.
Jared, you want to what's next for you?
Next for me, I'm with Erik that this roster is like interesting, but I would say that this is probably their least on the fly roster. This is the first full season of, hey, this is a lot of recruiting classes now under Dan that have been pretty good or ranked pretty good. You've had years of figuring out what these guys are and how they play football, maturing them, developing them, teaching them your systems on the offensive and defensive side. Like, this is probably the roster that Dan and Tosh and Will Stein probably have not, I don't know if I would say look forward to the most, but this is the guys that they hand selected theoretically. And they hand selected these recruiting classes as long as everybody, stayed around and everything. They didn't hit the portal. And then they also hit the portal. They went out and looked for guys that they thought were necessary. And it's been a different portal class. You can look just purely on the numbers and the type of guys that they're getting. They're going out, and if there's a hole to be filled on the roster, they're trying to do that. I think in years past, they've been adding guys to position groups that are weak and just hoping that something sticks and hoping that they figure out how to play at a Division I or a Power 4 level football program and play well, which for the most part has done really well. They've done a great job of scouting and directing and all that good stuff with Marshall and then the coaching staff and everything. But I think it's going to be there's going to be a lot of question marks if it's up to me. Like, I think that there's question marks in nearly every single position, maybe except for running back. But there's, like Erik said, you're only returning like 3 or 4 guys from last year's team. And sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes that's a really bad thing. And I think Oregon is kind of caught right in the middle of that. So again, I'm not trying to be pessimistic or anything like that, but that was one of the perks of last year's team was everybody came back. everybody said, you know what, we could all go to the NFL draft here and probably get drafted in the 5th and 6th round, but we're going to come back. We're going to go try to win a national championship. And they came relatively close as they have been for the last couple of seasons. But this is a new squad. All the people who have been questioning Dan's development, and everybody, well, this will be the year if it's put up or shut up. So I'm most interested in that and just seeing all the young talent come about that we've been hearing about for the last couple of years.
I think for me, Lanning has always talked about like the pillars and the leadership of the team, and a lot of guys that have been here for a while are now gone. Whether it's a year ago when some of the seniors graduated and left, or now this year with some more, like Terrence Ferguson, the 4-year starter. Herbert's, I'm not going to include Herbert in this, but like the tight end room's entirely new now from prior to Dan arriving, and Ferguson's leadership, whether it was in the tight end room, the offensive room, or just the entire program, is going to be felt. Like his departure's gone. Tez Johnson and his departure, his 2 years at Oregon was pretty influential. Jeffrey Bassa, a 4-year starter for Oregon, a guy that was here before Dan Lanning and bought into the Lanning era and has been a vocal leader for this team. He is gone. Gabriel's gone. That's going to impact things, but I think the quarterback position and the leadership that comes with it are pretty tied together, and whoever wins the job, I feel like will be a pretty good leader and will emerge as one of the leaders. But just a lot of the guys that have kind of set the tone, set the standard in practice, set the standard in the off season, and Lanning's 3 years prior are now officially all gone. And who steps into those new leadership roles? And that's along the lines of a lot what your guys are talking about of, hey, there's a lot of new faces, and there's going to be a lot of new leaders among those faces that are new. And is it going to be a first-year guy like Dylan Thieneman for the secondary? I would think so, but I don't know. Like, who steps up? Is it Poncho? Who's going to own the offensive line? Who's at receiver? Is it Evan Stewart that kind of becomes your alpha in that room that Tez had the last year and a half? Leadership is just going to be as important to me as finding out who your starting cornerback is.
And Matt, you're right. This is the time of year where those kind of developments start kind of forming, right? Like we've been through sports, like we in not as recently as these guys are not this high of level, but like the leadership and kind of like who you're leaning on a team, it kind of starts taking place like right around now, like months and months away from the start of the season, where you start kind of building those relationships when you first start this whole process. And so that's going to be, and you're right, Matt, like these are going to be some guys that have been on this roster for a couple of years. I think Poncho logically on offense as a 2nd-year starter at the position at center, where he's already kind of worked on some of that vocal leadership and being a voice in that room. I know talking to players last year, that was something where he really grew. Like, I think that's someone you can point to, but you're right. Like, and let's just jump into some of the storylines. Like quarterback is, and I think you're right that ultimately, whether it's Dante or Austin or somebody else, I think it's going to be one of those two. And most people think Dante, like that player will probably be a good leader and probably be somebody that you can rely on. But like, I don't know if this team knows that quite yet. Like, they haven't started spring practice. Neither of these guys have really played any meaningful snaps at this university before. Very young players, I think a lot of talent. So I think that's the obvious place to start going into spring, is like, you got a quarterback competition. It's very much open. Speaking with those guys at media day for the Rose Bowl down in Los Angeles right around New Year's, they were both pretty honest about like, we're kind of focused on where we are right now, but we're really excited about getting this competition going, and they respect each other and kind of what the other brings to the table, but also seemingly both very self-confident and go into this believing they can win this job. So it's a real competition between these two guys that are both young, inexperienced players. And like that sets the tone. And from a leadership perspective, it'll be a difference, right? Like Oregon's had the benefit of like, you just go through the quarterbacks. They haven't started an underclassman since Justin Herbert back in, 2017. That was the last time an underclassman was the starting quarterback here. Because I think, was Tyler a redshirt sophomore? Was he a junior when he started? Maybe it's 2020 then.
Probably redshirt sophomore.
Yeah.
Okay, let's say it's 20. I think it is 2020 now that sorry, apologies on that. But either way, like you've had the benefit of having Dylan and Bo and even Anthony Brown for as much, as much as people want to tear him down. Like he was somebody who was a leader in that offense and that team. And then obviously Justin before that, like you've had the benefit here at Oregon of having veteran leadership. That's going to be a shift this year, at least with the experience level of these two guys. So how does that all come together? I think that's kind of where it starts for me on offense. And I think probably pretty logically for most listeners of like, where does this work out at quarterback? And that's going to be one of, I think, the biggest items from this weekend is talking to Will Stein about like, where are these guys at? What's he seeing? What are his expectations? And just kind of getting a feel for where that's at. Because it's the most important position on the team. We all know that. And Oregon's had awesome quarterback play under Dan Lanning. What's it going to look like this year with two younger guys?
Yeah, that was my number one storyline was, who's the quarterback? Because Oregon hasn't had that problem for the last couple of seasons. But yeah, there's a lot of question marks there. I'm, I guess, naturally going to progress to the other side of the ball, which is what Erik and I do. He talks offense, I talk shop on defense. Guy, there are a ton of storylines to pick from the defense in general. I'm gonna, I guess, start with the secondary. That was the number 2 storyline that I had. No returning secondary players from this last year's program. Not a great thing. There was some pretty good players on that roster last year, and Muhammad and Nico Reed was a really good story from the season. Brandon Johnson was a solid star corner, and then even the safeties, for as much shit as they got in the Rose Bowl, were 2 pretty good safeties throughout the entire season. All those guys are gone, and Kobe Savage and Tyshee Johnson were the safeties I was mentioning. All those guys are gone. They're going to need to retool at every single level. They brought in Theron Johnson out of Northwestern, a cornerback, a second-team All-Big Ten coaches selection. They brought in a ton of cornerback talent in the last couple of recruiting cycles, and especially in 2025 when Naeem Offord and Dorian Brew and Brandon Finney, all top 100, top 110 guys in the country. They've got, Roderick Pleasant, Dalen Austin is playing at Star. They've got guys from last year's recruiting cycle like Ife Obadegwu and Dakota Fields who missed the whole season last year. They brought in Dylan Thieneman from Purdue. They have Kingston Lopa, Peyton Woodyard, an Alabama transfer who they were hot on in the recruiting cycle as well. Like there are a ton of names, a ton of theoretical talent in these recruiting classes that we really haven't been able to see. I mean, you go from Tyshee Johnson and Kobe Savage last year, who both played over 700 snaps for this defense, to my projected starters of like Dalen Austin and Kingston Lopa, who had a combined, I think it was 125. I wrote this the other day. That's a big difference. And there's not a lot of experience in this other than Theron Johnson and Dylan Thieneman. Like this is going to be, this was the problem in the Rose Bowl. This is the problem in basically every single one of Oregon's losses, except under Dan Lanning, except for Oregon State, has been the secondary. Obviously, the Washington the 3 times, Michael Penix Jr. carved him up, and then Ohio State. This is going to be the story for me, and this is going to be the story for a lot of fans, especially considering that their last loss of the season, or the season ended on a bad loss to Ohio State because of secondary issues. So this will be a fun group to watch. It'll fun group to maintain and kind of follow because of the youth, the talent, the recruiting rankings, the sky high potential that some of these kids possess. I think that's the biggest storyline for me going into spring camp. And that's kind of including where are these guys lining up? Where are they playing? Because that's always a fun thing to watch during the spring. And, other than, roster weights and stuff like that, just seeing where guys are lining up is going to be an interesting development to watch, but specifically in the secondary where, you think some guys are outside corners, maybe they move to safety, maybe they move to star. Just a lot of question marks in the secondary so far.
Yeah, I mean, the secondary for me was one of the ones I was going to talk about as well. Just all the new faces that Jared brought up. How does Jalil Florence factor in, if at all, in spring football? But I'm going to go back to the offensive side of the football. And I think quarterback's an easy one to pick, and that's kind of my topic. But at the same time, it's what does the offense adjustments look like with a new QB? We saw them from Bo Nix to Dylan Gabriel. What will be the changes that Stein makes to the play calling aggressiveness or the type of plays that they call? Do they run the football more? Do they run the football less with whoever wins the starting job? He told me down at the Rose Bowl, they build the offense. They've got all their pillars of what they want to do. They've got their traits that they want to have, but then once they actually start building the playbook, it heavily revolves first around what the quarterback likes, what the quarterback's physical limitations are, and what he excels at. And they literally ask him, once they figure out who's the starting quarterback, what do you like? What do you not like? What do we want more of? What do we want less of? And then they kind of build those tentacles, build those branches out from that discussion. And then the personnel that's around him will factor in as well. And maybe it's a two-part point here of like what Oregon's receivers are going to look different, and how does that impact what Oregon wants to do offensively? Do we see a major change to the offensive scheme and their aggressiveness? I mean, Decoria Moore is an absolute dynamic threat downfield. Evan Stewart showed it last year. Do we see more deep shots this coming season? And I think it's safe to say, like, Dante Moore has a stronger arm than Dylan Gabriel did. That's not to say Gabriel was weak, but Moore is just a different animal there. Does that impact things? Does the fact that Oregon's has kind of an established run game? And I know only Noah Whittington's back from the two-headed monster last year of Whittington and Jordan James, but they've added some pieces through recruiting. They've added some pieces through the portal the last couple of years, and they're expected to be, as good, if not better, this coming season. Do they lean on that? What does the offense look like with a new QB? That's going to be one of mine. I mean, it's probably going to be some subtle changes. It's not going to be probably anything overly drastic, but we watch them every day. We watch them every weekend, and we'll notice the changes, I think, probably in a couple of weeks of at least the regular season, probably not the spring season.
And I can't help, you kind of running through all the changes there, thinking about the offensive line. It's like another one where you've got 4 or 5 starters to replace. And I think they're a polarizing group for some. It was interesting. I just did my ranking the position groups before spring over on Duck Terror. You can go check it out. And I had the offensive line number 2 and got a ton of pushback on that from some people. And that doesn't really surprise me, because you look around, you do say, replacing 4 out of 5 starters on a position that relies a lot on like continuity and experience and time together, like that makes sense that there's pushback to the idea that that's going to be your best offensive unit. But you have to like what they've done through the portal too. And with just the fact that Isaiah World's the number 1 rated portal player, Pregnon, I think, was a number 2 or 3 rated guard. Harkey was another top, I think, 10 rated offensive tackle. So you're looking around, you go like, this is a group that you can be really excited about, but even that group has some questions. And as we touched upon a little bit ago, Alik Terry's lost a little bit of that safety net with Mike Kavanaugh going up to Corvallis there. And I think bringing in Cutter Leftwich, which we discussed, I think, at length a minute ago, but I think that helps mitigate some of that. I think that's a great addition. But like the offensive line, which is such a reliable, stable part of this offense. I think the last 2 years, Joe Moore Award finalist, something the school had never done pre-Alik Terry taking over. Can they get to that standard? You look at the recruiting rankings and you say, yeah, they should be able to get there. But I understand the hesitation, or I guess just the pessimism or concern about a group that is replacing a lot, especially because we look at last year and we saw early on there where when they didn't kind of have the right pieces in place, it was pretty ugly early. So that's a part that obviously you have to go into spring kind of wondering about. And as I'm saying this, I'm going like, we could talk about receiver and running back, which Matt did. There's a ton of questions at tight end. I could toss it over to Jared. He could run through probably every single position group on defense. Like, there's just a lot of questions with this team going into spring.
And that's the point I was trying to get at. And the first part of all of this is like, there's nobody who returns. Like it's a much different story than what it was last year. Last year at this time, it was, what's the biggest problem? And it's like, well, I don't really know who the backup left guard is. And it's like real James Crepia shit. And we like, that was the biggest problem. There wasn't any real question marks about the squad. And then this year is much different of a story. And quarterback, receiver, offensive line, like these are all incredibly important positions and things that'll eventually, be a very positive thing, or it could be a very negative thing. My second one on the list, again, defense will go here, is just, can the defensive line be somewhat as good as it was last year? Just because they're going to be losing out on Jordan Burch and Derek Harmon and Jamari Caldwell. Keon Ware-Hudson is another guy who was at least in the rotation a lot. They return Mateo Uiagalelei and Tatum Tuioti, which is huge for their defensive line depth and development. They also return Amari Washington, who was the fourth or fifth guy, probably the sixth guy in terms of leading snap counts last year. It was a backup nose tackle. They bring in Bear Alexander, who has troubled history at the college level at Georgia, leaving there early and then leaving USC early last season. But when he was fully healthy and prepared for his first season at USC, he was highly productive. Like, these are capable pass rushers, but there needs to be this level of depth that they can they can rely on, because if you don't have depth at the defensive line position, like you've seen in probably in 2022 in Dan Lanning's first year, like, there's not a lot of production coming from there. There's a lot of tired legs. There's not a lot of rotating in and out and trying to get people fresh. Like, that's been a big key during Dan Lanning's time at Georgia with his defensive line. It still is there. And when Oregon's been really going, like last year on the defensive line, when they had 40 sacks compared to 34 the year before, like, that's because of the depth and the keeping of the fresh of everybody. That's one of my biggest things, is like, who's going to step up in the second line? Is it going to be Terrence Green finally? Is it going to be somebody from last year's class like Aiden Breland or Tioni Gray? Will it be somebody that we don't expect, who could be, was really down on the depth chart last year, who comes in this season and has finally found things that click? Will it be another edge rusher? Will it be Elijah Rushing, guy who was the highest ranked player in their class last season? There's a lot of question marks there, to me at least, of what the depth of the defensive line looks like. And that's pretty it's a smaller kind of storyline heading into the season, but I think that plays a huge role in terms of the course of the year. Like, when Jordan Burch went out, there was enough depth there and then obviously Mateo is a pretty darn good player in his own right. But behind Mateo, there was enough depth there to kind of live without it and not see too much of a beat drop. And they have the talent there. It's just, are these guys developed? Can they go and perform out there at the highest level in the Big Ten? So I think that's one of the big storylines for me. And even if we probably won't get to watch any spring practices this year, but it'll probably be the same storyline going into the season, because I still won't have an answer into all those questions.
Yeah, I agree, Jared. I'm not anticipating 1 minute beyond the spring game of practice access. And quite honestly, like, with practice fields being what they are and unavailable, like, it sucks to watch practice in the Mo. Autzen would be cool, but it's they'll claim lack of space, which is silly because there's seats everywhere. But nonetheless, I think for me, this is maybe just kind of I was going to say the secondary, but Jared did a good job rolling through all the options there for my third one. But for me, like, there's a bunch of mini storylines with guys in particular I'm curious to see. And we won't know the answers to these until midway through the year, if not the end of the fall, when the regular season is over. But Bryce Betcher, I'm going to use him as an example, and he is one of them. Like, he went from non-draftable senior last year to someone that, like, legitimately was going to get picked if he went pro in the NFL. Where's the next jump for him this season? How high does his NFL stock climb? Where does he go from an individual standpoint, manning one of the inside linebacker positions for Oregon this season? And then there's, a guy like Peyton Woodyard, one of the few freshmen that played as a true freshman last year. Where's his next step in a secondary that, Jared talked about, a bunch of new faces? Is he going to secure one of those spots as a guy that plays? Kingston Lopa is another one. He got into the Big Ten championship game, and what does he do? What about a Kenyon Sadiq? What does he elevate? Where does he elevate his game? Moving from the third
That's a big one, Matt.
Yes, to now the number one tight end. Like, is this going to be his only year as a starter because he goes pro, because he has that good of a year, or is he going to be a guy that gradually kind of moves into that job? Justice Lowe, I mean, everyone loves Justice Lowe. The door is wide open for Justice to claim a starting spot at receiver. Will he take it, or will he get passed up by a Malik Benson who entered the program this offseason as a transfer portal addition? Or does a DeCorian Moore take one of those spots? And does Justice kind of stay in the same role that he was at this past season? Like, there's going to be a handful of guys, whether they're regular contributors or and they came off the bench last season, or they elevate themselves into a starter role, or like a Poncho. Poncho will be draft eligible after next season. Like, does he have a huge year, a la Jackson Powers Johnson just a couple years ago, where he got one full year of starting and turned into an All-American at the center position? Does Poncho still have? Is he following the same path? Granted, he's started now a couple years, but where do these guys elevate? Who becomes the next, like, hey, this is the new starter for Oregon. It's his first year starting and he turns into a stud? Or who becomes a fringe NFL guy and turns into a legitimate, like, you're going to be drafted in the 3rd or 4th round or the 2nd round of the NFL draft? And some of that we'll see signs of it. Jared's point, like, we probably won't see much practice, so we won't maybe know this till the season, but some of that we could potentially see if we get into practice or how they perform in the spring game.
I kind of like this happening organically, because I did want to, like, name 2 other guys that I have, like, that I think have the opportunity to have big springs, or that are important for springs. I did a story on this, I think, last week, of, like, these players will be, I think I did players and coaches will be, like, pivotal for Oregon's success this season, and, like, we need them to have big springs. And I'll just throw 2 of them out here who Matt didn't mention, because I think Matt ran through and hit on a lot of the ones I already had. But both of them are newcomers, and I'll start with Isaiah World. Like, I brought this up earlier. Like, when they initially brought him in, it was a really big deal, because it was like, okay, here's the Josh Connerly replacement. I think there's been a lot of added pressure with him being elevated to the number 1 ranked prospects in the portal this year by 24/7. We had Cooper Patagna on, I think sometime in February, and he was like, I think he's maybe already ahead of where Josh is in terms of, like, technical, some of the fundamental things, just in terms of the size and all of that. And, like, that was a comment that kind of raised some eyebrows, So, like, is he able to be that player? Because we talked about this offensive line is going to look so different. Part of the reason I have confidence in this offensive line maybe being one of the team's top units is because of an addition like that, of a guy you bring in and say, this is a 5-star transfer. This is the best transfer player in the country. This is a potential 1st-round draft pick. Well, if he ain't that, like, this offensive line is going to be a little bit of a different look. So that's one. And then we've mentioned his name several times, but I think the player for me that, if we are going to get practice access, this is who I'm going to be watching the most closely, I guess, would be DeCorian Moore. And that's such an easy one, but we so rarely see true freshmen come in here and do anything under Dan. Like, I mean, like, really, you can look at the snap counts. I think Peyton Woodyard, Jared, you probably know the number off the top of your head because you just had those first story. He had, like, 60 snaps last year, and that was the most of any true freshman, something like that, from scrimmage.
I think it was like something in the 70s. Like, it really wasn't anything.
Yeah, it was like, okay, so this guy was not very much involved. And that was the most involved true freshman last year. And the year before that, just go through the numbers. This has not been something that happens here. This is the rare guy we think can do it. This is the rare guy we think not only he could play more than 70 snaps, like, he could be one of the team's leaders in receiving. So what does he look like? I remember a long, long time ago, but when DeAnthony Thomas was a true freshman, they used to actually let you go out and watch those practices, Matt. You remember those days? And I remember going out to one of his first 5 or 6 and being like, oh my gosh, look at that guy move. That's different. And I kind of think that's what we're going to say about DeCorian if we get the opportunity to watch him. So that's an obvious one, but that's somebody I think you have to be really excited about.
No Devin Jackson love. I see it. I understand. It's fine. It's okay. It's just taking over Jeffrey Boss's position. Might be a little bit important this year. Yeah, there's a lot of those guys, and it all kind of comes back to the fact that nobody is returning, and you have to replace all of these incredible veterans. Like, how is Bear Alexander going to take Derek Harmon's spot? That's a pretty big ask. How is Mari Washington in his first year starting? How does he compare to taking over for Jamari Caldwell? You know, a lot of those question marks that you're going to be asking, like who is anybody going to be? Jabbar Muhammad. There's just a bunch of those questions. I kind of want to hit home more on the quarterback point here. I just because I know we've touched on it before, but I still feel like this has got to be the number one storyline going into camp.
Yeah.
Like there's not a quarterback. And I know we all want to say it's Dante Moore, and I think it'll eventually be Dante Moore, but this is the first year since theoretically 2022 and Dan Lanning's first year where it was Ty Thompson and Bo Nix. And looking back on that very clearly, that wasn't a competition. But at the time when everybody was coming into the year, that was seen as a competition. It wasn't. And this year, this might be the same exact thing. Maybe we get to October 21st and we realize that Dante Moore or Autzen Novosad is so much better than whatever the competition was, that it wasn't a competition. But going into spring ball, this is a real thing. Like Oregon's not going to have a surefire, like, hey, this is the quarterback this year going into spring football. So again, it kind of stinks that we're not going to watch probably any actual football. And we're just going to be able to hear coach speak from everybody for the next couple of weeks. But this is something that I would absolutely be watching is, you know, how these guys perform. And again, we're not going to see any of the scrimmages. We're not going to see anything like that of actual consequences or substance, but just seeing who's the first guy up for a rep. And, you know, some of that we kind of saw last year, like towards the end of the year, it was like just Dante Moore was the backup quarterback and he would come into the game more often. But again, he hasn't played starting football for well over a year now. And when he did at UCLA, obviously just a true freshman, but 11 touchdowns, 9 interceptions, barely completing over 50% of his passes. Like there are question marks there. Like I think that this kid's got all the talent in the world and was appropriately ranked as one. I think he was the first or second best quarterback in the class. Like arm strength, like Matt mentioned way earlier, is much better than Dylan Gabriel's. He's just can throw the ball real natural. But I just think that there's like, that's such a huge question mark going into the year for at least in all of the preseason, you know, after the national championship, all of the top 25 preseason team or preseason polls, like this is a consensus top 8, top 9 team in the country in all these preseason polls. And, you know, it's not like Penn State where they're returning all their offensive guys. Like they're not returning a quarterback here at Oregon. And I just think that has to be the biggest thing. And I think deserves, in my opinion, a little bit more time. Like, cause that's a real question mark for me going into this.
Yeah. There's a lot of assumptions that Dante Moore is just going to be one of the 10 best quarterbacks in the country.
Right.
And, like he could very well be that, but that's a pretty big assumption to Jared's point. And, you know, just like,
well, and Matt, we're also making the assumption he's starting first.
Yeah.
We're already jumping to the assumption he's beating out Autzen Novosad.
Correct. And just like if in basketball, like if you have a really dominant player, you can cover up a bunch of holes that your team may have because you have that one dominant player. In football, if you have a dominant quarterback, you can cover up a whole bunch of holes that may be around your team. You know, and one thing we haven't talked about a ton of, Eric, you brought him up as a world, but the offensive line, you know, they struggled the first 3-4 weeks of the season this past year. They had some new faces in there. There's going to be more new faces now. You lose your 2 tackles, Johnny Cornelius and Josh Connolly Jr. left early to go to the NFL. 2 guys that will be on an NFL roster next season. There's going to be change here. And how does that impact the ability to play at quarterback for what we assume Dante Moore or potentially Autzen Novosad? Like, you can have an elite quarterback, but if he doesn't have time to throw the football, he can't be an elite quarterback. So there's also a big assumption here that the offensive line is going to be bad. You know, and look, I think Alik Terry has earned the trust factor. I think Will Stein has earned the trust factor at quarterback as well. But those are 2 big assumptions where you kind of knew, like, in Dale Lanning's first year, he had a new QB, but you had a lot of guys back along the offensive line. And then the second year with Bo Nix, you had some of those offensive line guys were back, plus you had a returning QB. And then last year, you had kind of a blend of experience with one of the most experienced quarterback, but he was new in the system and they struggled. Now, the first 3 or 4 weeks. Now you have both again, where they're going to be changeover at both positions. Dante Moore's nowhere close to, or Austin Novas nowhere close to the experience level that Gabriel had. So there's going to be a learning curve there. And then your offensive line's got a bunch of new faces too. This is going to be an important spring for these guys to get on the same page, develop the right repetitions and practice, and work out the kinks now so that in fall camp you're building upon your playbook and not trying to master the base plays of your offense. Because if either one of those struggles, it could be a long year. Because like Jared's right, there's a lot of assumptions that Dante Moore is just going to be a dynamic top 10 quarterback in the country.
Well, and frankly, if he's not, Oregon's not anywhere near where they want to be. I mean, I'm not saying that in terms of like, he doesn't have to be a Heisman Trophy finalist for them to be a college football participant. I'm not saying that at all. But like in terms of like trying to compete at the highest level, you need high level play there. And just one thing on the offensive line to try to, because I'm ultimately very optimistic. I think we all are that this will work out. I think one thing to be optimistic about them starting off better, even though there's I guess almost less continuity, is at least you have continuity at center. Because I will go back and yell until I'm blue in the face. Like I really think almost all of those issues were they started with the wrong person at center last year. And I don't want to put that's not all on Charlie's shoulders necessarily, but I just think the fact that you had the wrong person at center, you had the wrong person at guard, like you just had everybody in the wrong place. Like I think it was really obvious pretty much right away. And at least going into this season that you've got someone at center you can trust on. And I think that is so important, especially at this program. So that probably came across more of a shot at Charlie than I wanted to, but it I think is accurate. I think figuring out center was such an important part of last year. And at least they go into this year knowing who they have there.
Well, until somebody gets hurt and they decide to put somebody else there at center and move him back.
You're right. That is also what happened last year. Yeah, right.
I mean, I agree. The assumptions here, like that, Dante's going to be the guy over Austin. Like I kind of buy into it. I think that he's going to be the starter, like I said, but I got to see it. We all got to see this, and we got to see it in games. We haven't seen it in games from either of these guys, and I think that they're both plenty talented. And I think they can both win you some games. I think honestly, with the lack of experience, I think potentially they could both lose you some games. Like Dante Moore, if he is the starter, or Austin is the starter, like they're going to have to be out at Penn State early on in the season, and that's not going to be necessarily the most inviting situation for them as they're potentially one of their first couple road starts in their career. So I mean, that's way down the line. You got to get into spring camp first, but I think that there's a lot of question marks going around, but I think the biggest one is obviously quarterback. But I think that Oregon has done a good job of potentially making their lives easier with going out and getting some really important offensive linemen in the portal with Pregnon and World and Harkey. Pregnon and World especially, like two of the better guys in the transfer portal. But then retaining Evan Stewart, bringing in DeCorian Moore, bringing in some bigger bodied wide receivers. Like I think they've done a good job of trying to ease these guys into this situation and not, fully expect them to be all world talent right away. Just like, all right, we're going to bring in Mekhi Hughes, a guy who's ran for almost 1,500 yards last year at Tulane. Like there's just going to be more weapons to go from. And this kind of goes to Matt's point way earlier in the podcast of like, what is the offense? How does that kind of change based on what the quarterback looks like? And I think they're just going to be multifaceted, multidimensional like they have been in years past. And that's really helpful when you can rely on the run game when your quarterback's maybe, it's not Bo Nix or it's not Dylan Gabriel. And that's okay because most programs don't have those guys as their quarterbacks. So I think it'll be fine eventually, but I just want to know, who's got the leg up, who's got the better chances of being the starter, who understands the offense better, who can throw the better deep ball, all that other stuff that goes with, evaluating a quarterback.
Spring football is right around the corner. You guys got anything left, or we want to wrap it up here?
I don't have anything. I'm just excited to be out there Thursday talking to Dan about some football.
Yeah, I got nothing.
We will be talking to Dan about some football on Thursday and then coordinators on Saturday. You can read all about it at duckterritory.com later this week, leading up to the week as well. Go to duckterritory.com for more coverage of Oregon football. But until the next one, you've been listening to the Autzen Audibles podcast.
Talk to you later, folks.
Peace.